Look, I think he's capable of negotiating anything away because he has no values or beliefs other than the greater glory of Donald Trump.
NATO defense ministers and service chiefs meeting in Brussels, as I say, after Donald Trump's his conversation with Vladimir Putin, that announcement on social media that talks on Ukraine would start immediately. Ukraine only mentioned and brought in afterwards. Nothing very much said about Europe. And in Brussels, the US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, he's been urging Europe to increase their defense spending significantly to 5%. So, welcome to the program, back to the program, John Bolton, the former United States ambassador to the United Nations and a former national security advisor in the White House. Welcome to you, Ambassador.
Glad to be back with you.
Good to have you here. We know, of course, you are a believer in the North Atlantic Alliance and America's historic role supporting European defense. What is the harm you fear will flow from President Trump moving, as he has, to negotiate peace in Ukraine directly with Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think it's very bad news for Ukraine. I think it's going to be bad news for NATO, and I think it's going to be bad news for the United States because the inevitable result of the way that Trump has approached this is to put Ukraine at a disadvantage that is not something you can make back up again during the course of the negotiations. He has made concessions, which I believe he probably made directly to Putin in his 90-minute phone conversation yesterday. Yes. That Hegseth announced, and he made them without negotiation, without any corresponding moves by the Russians. So yes. Right now, the Kremlin is in the pole position, and if they just sit there, perhaps Trump will make more concessions.
I mean, this isn't, as we know, the first time that Donald Trump has been accused of yielding ground to Vladimir Putin with no obvious reason. Ambassador, how do you explain this?
Well, I think Trump thinks, he has said he thinks Vladimir Putin is his friend. And he likes associating with people like Putin, like Xi Jinping, like Kim Jong-un. And he likes making deals. And, basically everybody else is kind of irrelevant. The two big guys sit down and they work things out. And that solves the problem. He can move on to something else. He doesn't really know what's at stake. He wants the war behind him. He said several times during the campaign the war never would have happened if he had been president. Putin, playing right into that about 10 days ago, said he basically agreed with Trump that the war wouldn't have happened if he had been president. They just released an American hostage earlier this week. That inflates Trump's ego. President Lukashenko of Belarus released an American hostage, same thing. So ex-KGB agent Putin has shown that he hasn't lost his touch in being able to manipulate Trump, yes. And Trump doesn't even know what's happening to him.
Why, though, do you believe the President Trump, had to play his cards the way that he did? You'd have thought it might have been perfectly possible to keep Volodymyr Zelensky in the loop while this was going. It might have been possible to communicate with European allies and leaders, but he did not do that.
Yeah. Remember, with Trump, there's no philosophy, there's no strategy, there's no policy. It's all personal. He doesn't like Zelensky. He hasn't liked him since the famous perfect phone conversation in the summer of 2019 that led to his first impeachment, where he tried to use suspending the delivery of American security assistance to get help finding Hillary Clinton's server. And it's never gone away. And why doesn't he deal with the NATO allies? Because he's just not that interested in NATO. I've been saying for some time, and I hope everybody now sees what the real attitude is. I've been worried that Trump would withdraw the United States from NATO, or cause it significant damage. And when he says, I want the European allies to spend 5% of GDP on defense when they're still barely at or not yet at 2%, shows that it doesn't matter what the number is. It doesn't matter what the European countries do. He's looking for an excuse to get out of NATO.
Yeah, I mean, you clearly take the view that what we're seeing now could harm America's national security interests. Just set out for me your vision of that harm. Are we talking about intelligence relationships? How do you see it?
Well, just basically in geostrategic terms, the United States learned in the 20th century and came to believe that peace and stability and free governments in Europe were in America's national interest after two hot wars and one Cold War. until there's peace and stability in Europe, America will be threatened directly or indirectly. And so, even though obviously Ukraine was not a member of NATO when the Russians invaded in 2014 and then invaded again in 2022, it had a direct impact on our interest, obviously disrupting peace and stability in Europe. And Trump behaves as if we had never learned those interests and weren't prepared to do anything about it. So this also sends a signal around the world. Let's just take hypothetically Taiwan as an example, that says if the United States and NATO won't guard against unprovoked aggression in the center of Europe, who thinks they'll do anything when Taiwan's turn comes up?
Just in passing, do you think it's possible that President Trump might actually negotiate away Taiwan's position and security in some future deal with China?
Look, I think he's capable of negotiating anything away because he has no values or beliefs other than the greater glory of Donald Trump. I will just tell you the story that I saw happen in the Oval Office many times in his first term. He'd hold up his Sharpie pen and he'd point to the tip and he'd say, "See that? That's Taiwan." And then he'd point to the Resolute desk, the gift of Queen Victoria, which is a huge piece of wood, and he'd say, "See that? That's China." That tells you what he thinks the relative value of Taiwan and China are.
Well, that's quite a story. I mean, you all know very well that Tulsi Gabbard has now been confirmed by Congress as the Director of National Intelligence in the administration. She's effectively oversees the CIA and other very important agencies. That's now been welcomed, I see, by, well, among others, a hardline Russian nationalist. And Russian intelligence, one of their chiefs is saying, let's us work together, Russian intelligence and American intelligence, which is pretty striking. What did you make of that?
Well, I think she's a disaster, and I think she will undercut the confidence that countries we share intelligence with about whether that intelligence will be protected from our adversaries. It's inconceivable to me that she has any value added in that position. She knows nothing about intelligence gathering. She has demonstrated extraordinarily bad judgment over the years in a host of areas. Just coming to Ukraine as one example, sometime back, she said that Russia was justified in invading Ukraine because the U.S. was funding biological weapons laboratories in Ukraine, which is wrong on more levels than we have time to discuss. That's the kind of person now as Director of National Intelligence.
Yeah, I must ask you, Ambassador, and again, thank you for coming on. I mean, just a little earlier on, before I came into the studio to start today's program, we've been seeing European NATO members promising to up their spending on defence. Now, Donald Trump has been pushing for that, and he's not the first president or senior US leader to believe it's not fair for America to shoulder the burden of European defence in the way that America has for so long. Do you welcome that development?
Well, I do, but I tell you, the Europeans have done all of us a disservice the way this has happened. I'm only one of thousands of Americans over the years who has tried to persuade Europe politely to increase their defense spending. And honestly, we didn't do that well until Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. So along comes Trump and slaps them around, and not politely, I might add. And what do? They increase defense spending. That's the wrong lesson to send.
All right. Ambassador John Bolton, the former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations and a national security advisor, formerly in the White House. Thank you for coming on the program, as always.